Rhonda, welcome to Multispective. I am so excited to have you here with us.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. And from Indiana to you in China, a wonderful, blessed platform you have where we can be multinational and really bring people together and talk about sensitive subjects that just might need a multiple perspective.
Well, what's your personal story and what got you here?
It started with the fact that my grandparents were Polish immigrants in 1913. And so when they got to the United States, they had a mentality of survival. So I came from some storytellers. My grandfather is the first person and probably the only person in my life that I'll ever meet that could tell the story of the Great Depression and make a teenage girl want to live during that time and try to get a job. It was impossible back then. But he would tell stories about how he survived and how he was in the military and everybody told him, don't drop out because there's no jobs out there. And he did anyway. He wanted to be home with his family. When he got home, he had to prove that he could get a job in an environment where people were round the block for just bread, let alone a job. And so hearing stories like that as a child and having an entrepreneurial father and mother, you'd hear other stories of how you just pick up your bootstraps. If you fall down 7 times, get up the 8th. So that was already kind of built into my protective factor, into my experience. But then when life started hitting me, you learn as a child, okay, just keep moving forward. You keep on moving forward. But then you get your first real big life hit moment. The first one for me was I had taken on a job in a retail store. And someone came in. He had a knife. It took away my innocence. How am I going to survive and how am I going to handle this? I went back to those storytellings. And I started rebuilding and repairing. I thought I had my life by the tail. I was doing well. I had the job that I dreamed of. I was a administrator for a college. And, I'm going through life just happy. I'm making money. I'm a good, solid relationship. And I'm sitting on my couch journaling on a Saturday morning. And there's I knock at the door. And I open the door, and it's a police officer. Not what you normally would expect on a weekend morning, right? And the police officer tells me that my son was shot and killed at work the night before. And in that moment, that life hit moment, this is one of those ones that changes and you're never going to be the same again. I had to practice what I'd learned for years. Trial and error, from self-help book to self-help book to learning from experience after experience. And that is, name the pain. Understand what you're actually experiencing. And make the decision that you'll survive it. It's a process. It's a time. There's a grief cycle. There's all these things steps that you have to go through. But the very first thing is to name it and commit yourself to the fact that you will survive it. And for me, it was taking and watching the crack on a wall where the house had settled and following up to the ceiling that I'd never even noticed before. And at the very end, when it reached the ceiling, I said, it'll be okay. I knew there were steps that I needed to take. And I turned childlike. And I started thinking about the little, jingles we hear when we're children that make you happy, like put one foot in front of the other. And I started faking the processes that I knew I had to do. When I say faking, I was actually doing them. But my body felt like it was a shell and really wasn't doing them. And so I could notify the people that needed to be notified, talk to the people that needed to be talked to, and start going through that grief cycle. And
how long did it sort of, okay, so walk me through sort of what happened for you and and sort of what was that experience? So, you wake up one fine morning, your son at this point was already working individual. Was he living at home with you? Was it one of those
No,
situations
he
where,
had his own
no?
children. He had his own children and his own girlfriend,
Wow.
and in his own place. And the police came to the contact. Who is this person's contact? He worked in a club, so he was he was an adult, and he was a bouncer, and they had put a young man out that had been causing ruckus, causing fights in the bar. And when they opened up the door at last call, he was there with a gun and shot the whole security team.
The whole security team. Wow. Was your son, was he sort of injured with this? Was he like taken to hospital? Was there still a chance of recovery, or was it pretty instant?
It was instant for him. Now, the rest of the security team was different. They all ended up surviving in different forms of issues. One, incapable of having a normal life again. Another one, luckily, he's carrying the bullet with him. They could not remove it because it was lodged in a place that if they did, he probably would not have survived. And then another one that witnessed it was killed at a later date.
At a later date?
Yes.
So that one was definitely like with intentional, was like,
right.
Planned. So you get informed by the police that this has happened. Do you recall what happened in that very instant when you were informed this? What was immediately in that moment, what was your thought process?
Well, immediately I was in shock. So much in shock that I don't really remember much more of that day other than the crack on the wall that I followed. And I do remember his girlfriend coming. I don't even think I had told her that I already knew. I think I was just so much stunned that I just let her tell me that, what she had learned and how, what she knew. And I think the one thing that people can realize that when you're in those moments, there is no right or wrong. The storm is being created around you. You are like the eye of the storm. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's rough. Sometimes it's, transforming into something else. It's up to you on how you want to approach the next steps.
Right.
We can choose to put more energy into the storm and create more chaos and strengthen the storm by our own mental and emotional reaction. Because you have a reactive spirit sometimes, and other times you can have a peaceful spirit and go through it. So for me, I think I went through the peaceful mourning process of it. I didn't add more chaos. It was too much chaos for me to add any more energy to it. But sometimes in our own storms, we do. We lash out at people that we love. Maybe don't pay our bills. We might, not eat right. And so then we start, having health issues. And so these are the intentional things that we can do to give ourselves strength.
So I'm actually curious to know, like, you mentioned that the way that you handled it was like in a much more peaceful kind of way, like kept maybe more quiet and kind of went through it more internally. What about his partner? What about your husband or the father of him? How did sort of the people around you that were going through the same morning? I guess there were plenty of storms happening around. Everyone was in the middle of their own kind of stormy situation. How did other people sort of respond and react to it?
And you're exactly right. They call it the domino effect, especially when there's a crisis that is violence oriented, in the case of a murder. Everything just keeps on multiplying to all the people around them that may know them, may love them, so everybody does have different vulnerabilities and risk. For me, my risk was maybe depression, not knowing what to do. He had small children, so, who's going to care for them? And how was that going to be navigated? Because his girlfriend was only the mother of one of his 3 children. And then he had a baby mama with, that had 2 of his children. And she was going through her own struggle. So how are we going to navigate this? What's going to be fair and right for everybody? So it was a matter of logically going through who's going to do it. I would say everybody handled it the best they could. And I would call it the spirit of calm, or the perseverance of calm helped. But then, you still have the trial too, and that was a 5-year process. And so you continued to have to relive the violent act and the emotions that came through it, and where you were in your recovery of those emotions each time another court date came, another moment came, another birthday came. So I found, and I chose to try to empower myself to look for joy in those moments too. So gratitude lists help. And then also remembering the things he loves. So like on his birthday, I still today will make a steak. Because he would always say, no matter what holiday it was, he wanted a steak. So, the small things you can do to keep them in your lives, although they're no longer there.
Right. It sounds like you've really kind of pulled yourself together through it all, and even kind of maybe be that rock for the family as well, that maybe were kind of falling apart in their own ways. But yeah, I just want to kind of ask this again, what might grief, what can grief look like? And so this is sort of why I asked, how would you describe how, his partners, or, the loved ones in his life, the other loved ones in his life, how they were sort of grieving through this process, of mourning through it. What can it look like? What are the things that we can look out for? And how can we help other, people that may be in their own grieving process?
Well, the first thing for me is I had to find a support network outside of the life hit. Because they were already going through enough. Doesn't mean you don't still tell the stories. But grief hits you at the weirdest times. You could be in your car on your way to a business meeting, and then all of a sudden I just start crying, or maybe you're done with, exhaustive day at work, and, the same thing. So I found support not only in the unit, but outside of the unit, so I wasn't draining the unit. I found different religious organizations, different mental health groups, and I would go to their meetings, their services. It didn't matter to me what even denomination of religion it was, because everyone had something that they could add to helping me recover. Well, I could be on a mat, praying. I could be meditating. I could be getting laid and my hands laid on me. I could be getting oil on my forehead. All of them worked because it made me internalize and pull out the grief in that moment and be intentional about asking for healing. And so same thing with the mental health experts. When you go to a mental health expert, what that does is it allows you, whether it be talk therapy or, whatever kind of therapy you're going through, it allows you to do that in a safe environment with people that aren't going to add to the fuel and to the hurt that you're already going through, because they don't know how to handle it. They're not professionals. Somebody else might drink too much. Somebody else might turn to substance abuse. Those are that is adding to the energy of the fire instead of adding to the calm.
Right. Did you find that you and your family, while going through this grieving, were kind of trauma bonding, or do you feel like it was quite an isolating experience as in with your family?
I think we all pulled away for a while, but that every time we were together, it was like the elephant in the room. You could feel that we understood. There was no judgment. I think that's real important. People grieve in different ways, and when you put judgment out there, all that does is destroy the relationship by the reaction that people have towards
Yeah.
each other that is negative. So it's better to stay in that space of understanding, compassion for each other, looking at each other with love, and kindness, even when the actions may not reflect that person deserves it. Give them that grace, because
Right.
different people are going to react differently at different times, because they're a human too, with their own needs and desires and wants.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, unfortunately, there is like a little bit of an expectation, and maybe even not a stigma, but but yes, a judgment in like how a person sort of responds or reacts to the loss of a loved one. I've watched a couple of like movies where parents have lost their child, and maybe the father is trying to function with it, still go to work and try to meet their friends, and sort of stay afloat in that sense. And maybe going through that grieving very quietly and silently on their own, but on the outside are very fully functional. In some of these scenes, you see how the mother and the father actually get into these really big fights, because the wife is like, why are you not more upset about this, and why are you not crying more, and why you don't seem like you're so affected by this, like our son has died, like how can you? And a lot of couples get pulled apart, and they just can't seem to sort of make it through that process. So can you just share a little bit about what that was like for you and the father of your child? What was that like?
We didn't make it. I'll be honest. We didn't make it. We had differences of opinions of how things should be handled and navigated, and it was traumatizing for both of us. I would say he would have been more of the more stern, just move on, go on with life, and I was stayed in it longer, and it made me vulnerable to others who might not have good intentions for me, because I was going through a divorce. I was going through a grief cycle. So that's one of the reasons why I say go with care. And, you have to pick experts to lean on a lot of times, not somebody you've picked in the emotional aspect of things.
It makes a lot of sense to be able to lean on families and friends and people around you that and are familiar with, but also to be able to turn to someone who can actually maybe give you some steps to guide you through that process. And I love that you talked earlier about really seeking out different religions and seeking out. So it's like you were very proactive in that healing process for yourself. And you sat in that grief, you experienced that grief, you experienced all the pain, but then you also said, okay, like I'm going to experience it, but I'm also going to try to find whatever path, whatever ways that I can. Being really intentional in that healing process is such a powerful thing, because sometimes it can be really hard, especially, it feels like your life, your purpose has been sort of like pulled under you. Can you walk me a little bit more through sort of like the very first thing that you did to sort of seek out some kind of help? Where did you first go? What was that resource that you first leaned into?
So the first would be a religious organization that I'd never gone to. I was driving down what we call the Meridian in Illinois area in Indianapolis. I was driving, and it was one of those the moments where you're just, the streaming of the tears are going down, and I see this small church. It was very small. It probably had less than, I don't know, maybe 50 people in it. And I see it, and I pull into I see that people are walking in, and they're having a service. And so I go, and they pray with me. They did communion, and the oil on the forehead. I'd never experienced it that way. I was raised a Baptist. This was more of an apostolic.
Okay, never heard of this.
church, which is a more conservative in their thoughts. And I'd never been to that kind of a service. And I had been practicing at that point Episcopalian religion, but they were not open. My church was not open. So I went in there, and the women there made me feel so supported and so loved. I ended up going quite frequently there. A lot of times when people were like, why would you go, to this small church? And I was like, it made me feel like I was home, even in my pain. And what I learned from the various organizations and religions and places that I stopped in under impulse like this was there's different forms of healing. So let's take, for instance, meditation. There's breath work, there's visualization, there's, actively seeking different mindsets through whether it be, your senses. Candle that is instead of a lighted candle, it is one driven by batteries, and it gets the shimmers at a certain time, like almost balls. So your sense sometimes by just meditating and watching, when it starts to light up right around 7 p.m. and the shimmers start going, I automatically, my eyes dart to it, and I hold on to it for just 1 second longer than I normally would, because it brings me the feeling of pleasure. It brings that child out like snowflakes coming. Same thing, a lava lamp could do the same thing. Watch it, move around. So going through the fact that meditation makes a big difference, prayer makes a big difference. So each religion has a different way of praying, so you're feeling it from, a different senses. Some have you kneel on your knees on a bench. Others have you stand when you pray. Others have you get on a mat. So you're in that prayer mode. You're actually having a relationship with your God, your spirituality. Another form that helps, exercise. That is a form of healing. And I'm not talking about going to the gym and lifting weights. I'm talking about walking in nature, looking for the things in nature that can put a smile on your face. And so that's another form of healing. Journaling your thoughts. I have a book that's coming out called Resilience, and that it takes you through all the steps of resilience. But the last half of it is daily practices. So affirmations and saying them over to yourself, looking for words that mean strength or whatever, the resilience factor is. And I wrote poems during my storms at different times because I was journaling. So I've turned that into part of the practice and added with it my visualization process when I was going through it. So maybe it was climbing a steep mountain. Maybe it was that I was the anchor in the storm. And then, so I'm hoping that others can go through the process of healing and realize healing takes action. If I had stayed in bed, there would have been no action. Cooking. Some people might say, well, that's work. That's not healing. No. As you clean your fruit and do your prep work with the vegetables and stuff, you're actually tell yourself, I'm doing this because this is what's best for putting good things in my body. So make sure you're intentionally getting it in. And that food prep can make a big difference in your mental capacity because you're doing self-love.
Can you talk to me a little bit about like any grieving groups? Did you ever join any of those grieving counseling groups?
I did not join a grieving counseling group. I should have, but I did not because I didn't always navigate things well. I was more impulsive, so I didn't know where they all were and when they went. I mainly did the mental health and the spiritual health.
I'm surprised though that like if you were seeking a therapist that wouldn't have been something that would be recommended to sort of join, because a lot of times people do say like, connecting with others that are grieving can be really healing, and just simply having someone else who can really, really understand that experience, that process.
I would highly recommend it. I think it probably was recommended to me. I probably went in one ear, out the other, because at that point in my life, I wasn't as structured as I needed to be. So, I would have had to know the time. It was more, I ended up doing a lot of things from shooting from the hip
Right.
and impulse and from my emotions rather than a planned strategy.
I think that that's also really great that you were like leaning into the emotion, and
Right.
yeah, maybe it seems like it was impulsive, but it was kind of like, yeah, you mentioned you're in your car, you're crying, you turn around, you see this church, and your heart, your feelings in that very moment is the thing that said, I'm gonna go there, because you could have easily just looked at it, moved on, right? But the fact that you kind of like leaned into that emotion in that very moment, like, I wonder, kind of just want to highlight, emphasize how, like, sometimes leaning into that emotion, especially when you're in a very emotionally vulnerable situation and place, leaning into that can be really, really powerful in itself.
The reason I was more impulsive with it rather than more structured, when I had lost my mother to breast cancer 5 years before that, I did not go through the grief cycle. I just went back to work. So I
Right.
think that impulsiveness was my permission to feel,
Right.
because if you go straight back into your daily routine after a traumatic life hit moment like that, you are sometimes you're not allowing yourself to go through the grief cycles. So I think that was probably why I was more impulsive to the emotions, because I wanted to feel it
Right.
and I wanted to handle and heal. So I think you're right.
Right.
Leaning into it was what was best for me at that moment.
Can you tell me how could it go if an individual does not, or decides to completely just shut it off and move on and not lean into that grieving cycle?
Well, you become unavailable. The hurt is so tender at that point, at least for me, that the shell of me was an like a sore or bruised individual walking around, and then anybody that would try to reach out or touch or to experience life with me, when I didn't allow myself that grieving moment, I didn't have the capacity to add one more thing on, so I became less productive too. I was still working, I was still doing things, but it was not with any kind of intentional. It was
Right.
just surviving.
What was that moment that you kind of went, aha, like, I really do feel much better now. Like, I can actually now live.
I would say it took probably about 4 years to feel like I was really living. I still lived, but before I felt like I was healed, where I could actually contribute back to to people the way I had before. I isolated a little bit to allow myself into those moments and to heal. And but during that time, I would tell people not to make major decisions if you have to, because you have to allow yourself time to heal, to know who you're going to be on the other side. And I had so many things, a split of relationship, the death of my son, the navigation of life and the trial. So probably all of that was it was too overwhelming for me to add one more big decision in it. So isolation was the best thing for me. Now, when I say isolation, I still stall people, but let's say I went to a family event and everybody was joyful. Let's say Christmas, for instance, and everybody's exchanging gifts and happy. And, there, I was able to maybe stay there, and I would try to prolong it a little longer than maybe till I was completely uncomfortable. But then when I was going to have that breakdown moment, I would leave, because that was their moment to stay happy, my moment to grieve then. So, it's okay to do that. And it's okay to allow your loved ones to do it, but just don't allow them to completely isolate where they're not healing.
Yeah. I like that. It's like a fine line between sort of like a safe and healthy isolation versus, isolation that's kind of borderline depression where, that person is kind of slipping into their own kind of, painful sort of state of mind, right? Would you say writing for you, I know you mentioned journaling, but like creative writing, the books, would you say that you found your sort of creative element and spirit through this journey, or was that something that came a bit later?
I would say it has improved my creativity. I had already started writing prior to that, but it gave me a layer of understanding of what people go through. Crossroads is a crime thriller. So
Right.
it introduces some of my community service work experiences,
Right.
even though if anybody out there's never been to Indianapolis, all the sites are real sites in Indianapolis. I give you the historical context so you understand the history of it. But the crime itself is fiction, and it's intended to show what happens when you're out of balance. So every character is out of balance with their life. So you have the workaholic, you have the law and order guy, you've got the guy that's dedicated to his friend, and you have this trial, and it's the death of a 15-year-old girl, and you have to figure out, okay, what happened to this girl? Why does everybody seem like they're a loser in the process? Even though, you would think that the jury isn't a loser. Well, they are a loser. The workaholic's there. She wants to be back at work. She wants to not be having to deal with this heavy load right then. And it's about how we make our decisions during those life hit moments. What are we going to do when we get the knock on the door? What are we going to do when our friend asks us to go someplace and we know they're drunk and we get in the car anyway? What are we going to do when we're lonely because we've put so much into one aspect of our lives and we're not paying attention to the 13 other areas? And what happens to our lives when we're that way? So when we make those decisions, we have to realize that not everything is for everybody and not everything is intended to be lifelong.
I like that. What was your sort of inspiration for this story?
I wanted to explore the emotions that I experienced, which was anger, fury, and envy. Anger is cruel. When you see things that people have done under the terms of anger, they're just cruel. Fury is overwhelming. I mean, that's when you have those passion moments and, there could be a crime. But who can stand before jealousy? Jealousy is a whole new level of crime. And in Proverbs it says, envy makes the bones rot.
Yeah, that's really true. Why envy?
I think it's because it deteriorates. Even when you're in crises, if you're envious of others, you could strike out to them. If
Right.
you're living your life, let's say you're in a perfectly fine time of your life and you start getting envious of another person, or, what ends up happening is you start deteriorating your own life. You start discounting it, putting it on the Goodwill rack, on sale, like what you've accomplished, what you have is nothing. And you're basically providing your own form of cancer. And you don't have to. It's a choice. You have a choice not to go down that path and enjoy what you have with intentionality.
Right. And again, especially when it comes to like grieving, it's so much easier to fall into those kind of like negative mindsets, right? And that be anger, fury, envy, all of these kind of things. It's part of that, just that that sadness that we experience. So sometimes it is actually easier for us to kind of fall into those negative mindsets. It's so hard sometimes to sort of be positive. And even unfortunately, people are drawn towards negativity, for the media also is always sharing negative stuff, movies, crime, all of it, right? So yeah, I like that when, you've mentioned intentionality and sort of, doing the necessary steps to kind of, help yourself through it. Really well
Open
said.
your blinds, look outside, go take a 5-minute walk. It doesn't have to be a 5-mile walk. Sometimes just doing something active helps you navigate those storms.
Yeah, for sure. I really, really appreciate you sort of like being on the podcast today and sharing your journey and being so vulnerable about your story as well. And I really think that you have, so much to offer and share for our listeners sort of take away in this. So yeah, I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. And I hope that everybody out there, no matter where you are in the world, what you're going through, just remember, make every day great. And remember, if you have a desire and a dream, go after it. If it's meant to be, it's up to you. We sometimes lean into wanting other people to help us through things. Sometimes it has to be you.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
𝗠𝗂𝗹𝘁𝗁𝗂𝗃𝗲,
𝗠𝗂𝗹𝘁𝗂𝗃𝗲.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm 𝗠𝗂𝗃𝗁𝗂, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.